I just want to thank everyone so much for joining us tonight, especially Thom and David. I'm Emily. I'm one of the events hosts here at Powell's Books. And before we begin, I just want to quickly encourage you to check out our lineup of upcoming virtual events online at powells.com. One of the many upcoming events we're especially looking forward to is Elizabeth Colbert in conversation with Bill McKibben. That's coming up next Tuesday, February 9th. If you don't already, please consider following us on social media for more updates. Tonight, we are so excited to welcome Thom Hartmann and David Korten. Thom is a progressive, national and internationally syndicated talk show host. Talkers Magazine named him America's most important progressive host and has named his show one of the top 10 talk radio shows in the country every year for over a decade. He's also a New York Times bestselling author of 26 books that have been translated into multiple languages, and I'm so impressed by that number. His newest book, The Hidden History of American Oligarchy, Reclaiming Our Democracy from the Ruling Class, looks at the history of the battle against oligarchy in America and how we can win this latest round. Joining Hartmann in conversation this evening is David Korten. He's the co-founder of Yes Magazine, president of Living Economies Forum, and a member of the Club of Rome. He writes a regular column for Yes and is the author of numerous books, including the international bestseller When Corporations Rule the World. So this evening's event will include a conversation between the two of them, and then it will also include an audience Q&A. There's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you would like to ask a question, please use that module. As well, if someone has typed a question that you'd really like to know the answer to, please upvote that question. It'll make it more likely to get asked. And perhaps most importantly, please consider supporting both Thom and Powell's by purchasing a copy of the book. I'll be sharing a link to purchase multiple times throughout this evening. David, Thom, thank you both so much for joining us. I'll let you take it away.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Emily. Yeah. Thom, it's just such a privilege to be back with you having another of these conversations about your latest book, but I guess that could happen every 6 months. Very impressive. Now, I know you not only as a long and valued friend, but also as an extraordinary scholar of history and law, a superb political analyst, and a spiritual seeker. One of the most incredible human beings I know. And your many books are so informative, as well as engaging calls to action. Now, I found this one, The Hidden History of American Oligarchy, to be particularly timely, terrifying, captivating, and meticulously documented as an analysis of the treachery by which the ruthlessly deranged have gained the loyalty of the desperate, using money's power to strip us of our humanity and agency. I just gave it my second read in preparing for this discussion, and I learn more each time. Now, this particular book comes at such a timely moment because we're experiencing a momentary respite from an inspiring imperial family backed by a political party unflinchingly committed to rule by the wealthy, dedicated to self-enrichment. And here you are with a book that gives us a deep historical perspective. So on with the conversation. So again, just a few months ago, we met here to talk about your previous book, The Hidden History of Monopoly, addressing the growing concentration of corporate power. Now, it's remarkably fitting to follow this with a conversation about oligopoly, which is the process by which the few acquire the power to exploit the many, a purpose that the corporate charter is well designed to serve. Just check. Have I got that right? I think we're on the same page here, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, oligarchy, I would define oligarchy as rule by the rich.
Yeah.
It's when political power is concentrated in a small number of hands, typically wealthy people, and monopoly or oligopoly as essentially the concentration of economic power within the marketplace as opposed to the political sphere. So, but the books are kind of bookends of each other, or one segues into the other. Yeah, absolutely. And they were intended to be that way.
What we're seeing more and more is the domination of the political by the economic.
Yes.
As if they were once separated.
Yeah.
Anyhow, now you got an extraordinary knowledge of the founding of this country. And there's a thread in your writing that leaves me puzzled. We were in the beginning, as we are now, a nation of extreme inequality with slaves and indentured labor on the bottom. And you might say that we've actually improved a little bit since then, especially given the fact the founders created a constitution that gave the vote only to white men who owned property. So that was probably a minority of white men. And in some states, the men had to be non-Catholic Christians, as well as perhaps other qualifications. Now, citizens with a vote would have been a very distinct minority of that population compared to now. And yet in your writing, you seem very clear that while we are currently a monopoly, you do not actually apply that label to the nation we were immediately following the revolution of 1776.
You mean oligarchy, yeah.
Or oligarchy, yeah. Why not?
Well, first of all, the founders did not specify that only property-owning white men could vote. In fact, there was a discussion of that during the Constitutional Convention in either late July or early August of 1787 in Philadelphia. And it was a relatively brief conversation and was rejected. Those are rules that were put into place by a number of states as time went on. But at the time of the ratification, the years immediately following the ratification of the Constitution, there were women voting in multiple states. There were freed blacks voting in multiple states. The gradual rigidification of the voting franchise happened principally between 1805 and 1830 as the Southern oligarchy rose up and turned the South from something sort of resembling, at least for white people, a pseudo-democracy into an absolute terror-driven fascist police state, which ultimately, as I lay out in the book, ultimately challenged all the rest of us.
Wow.
I think that there are cheap history distresses me, and it's easy to for people who either want to prove that being a billionaire is a normal thing, having billionaires in a society, literally people with tens or hundreds of thousands of millions of dollars, at the same time that there are people, earning $5,000 a year, that's somehow normal and that's the way it's always been in America. Yeah. That was very much not the case at the founding of this republic. And Wikipedia's errors notwithstanding, at the founding of this republic, and of course, we'd been here on this continent for some time. The wealthiest man among the people who signed the Declaration of Independence was John Hancock. And in today's dollars, his wealth, independent of land, and he did not own very much land actually, was about $700,000. There have been several books about the lifestyle of the founders, particularly those who were not slave owners, but even the slaveholders. It's very difficult to separate anything from the fact that they engaged in this vile practice. That said, none of their homes, even Monticello or Mount Vernon, they were like summer cottages compared to the landed gentry of England, with castles. We did have some fabulously wealthy people at the time of the American Revolution. The Johnson family, for example, who lived on the Hudson River, had a 60-room castle. They had over 100 retainers, they called them. About half of them were freed slaves who had come up into New York and were working and being paid. And about half of them were Europeans who had come over, and they dressed in ancient livery. I mean, this is a really, really rich family. There were a few dozen families like that. All of them got their money from the UK. All of them were here at the request of the king. The Johnson family moved to Canada during the Revolution. The value of land was quite small. And the idea that, there's been this question, why did the people who wrote the Constitution. James Madison, of course, kept the notes of the Constitution. Why did nobody publish anything about the actual debates in the Constitution? And why did James Madison keep his notes secret for 50 years? It was an agreement that he made with everybody else, that all of his notes would be secret for 50 years after the death of the last person, which turned out almost to be him. He died, as I recall, in 1836 or 38. And it was 50 years later, and that his notes were published. And what we found in the debates was that it wasn't a bunch of rich guys strutting around saying, we want the whole thing. Forrest McDonald did a really brilliant analysis of this in a book. And if I could just read about 5 sentences to you from this. He published it in 1958. It's called We the People, the Economic Origin of the Constitution. And he notes that a quarter of the delegates to the Constitutional Convention had voted in their own state legislatures or sponsored legislation to help debtors and the poor. Quote, another fourth of the delegates had important economic interests that were adversely affected directly and immediately by the Constitution they helped write. He said the most common and by far the most important property holdings of the delegates were not mercantile, manufacturing, and public security investments, but agricultural property, which basically didn't have, it wasn't easy to convert into cash at that time. It didn't have a lot of value. He continues, he says, it's abundantly evident that the delegates once inside the convention behaved as anything but a consolidated economic group. And then you can actually read that when you read Madison's notes, which I've done, in fact, twice. In addition to that, what Forrest McDonald did that was really brilliant is he went through the notes from all the ratifying conventions in all the states, the people who actually said, yes, this Constitution reflects our values. We want it to be the law of the land. And he goes on to say 77% of the delegates, this was in the state of Delaware, were farmers, more than 2/3 of them small farmers with incomes ranging from 75 cents to $5 a week. Slightly more than 23% of the delegates, which were professional men, doctors, judges, and lawyers. None of the delegates was a merchant, manufacturer, banker, or speculator in wealth in Western lands. And then he looks broadly at all the states. 64.1% of the people who ratified the Constitution, 64.1% were farmers. The opponents of ratification included from 3 to 6 times as large a proportion of merchants, lawyers, and investors in shipping, confiscated estates, and manufacturing, as did the delegates who favored ratification. He goes on to say in South Carolina, no fewer than 82% of the debtors and borrowers of paper money in the convention voted for ratification. Of the known farmers, 67% voted in favor. And then, asking the question, was this ratified specifically for their economic interests? He says, and I quote, this is the last sentence, the opposite is true. In both states, the wealthy, this is Virginia, North Carolina. In both states, the wealthy planters, those with great wealth, as well as those without personality interests, were divided approximately equally on the issue of ratification. In North Carolina, small farmers and debtors were likewise equally divided. And in Virginia, the great mass of the small farmers and a large majority of the debtors favored ratification. The Constitution was ratified by poor people, not by rich people. The rich people, by and large, opposed it. So the reason why Madison kept those notes secret for 50 years was because many, if not most, of the people in that convention were betraying their class.
Wow. That's why I like to turn to you for history.
Well, it's so easy and cheap to either say, oh yeah, there were just like billionaires and poor people,
Yeah.
On the one hand, for people who want to justify billionaires, which is what you'll find on some websites. And then, or on the other hand, oh yeah, it was all about, wanting to dominate people who were enslaved. And that was the only issue that was at play. And that, by and large, that was not even an issue at all in the northern states. And, they played half the role here.
Now, we're always hearing conservatives talking about the founders' intention.
Yeah.
What, from all your incredible reading of that history, how would you describe their vision of the country that they foresaw emerging out of this revolution?
Well, I think the amazing thing is that this country, and I realize it almost sounds cliched these days, but it's really a deep and profound reality, that this country was founded on an idea rather than on DNA or genetics. It's true that most of the people who came here, in fact, virtually all of the people who came here voluntarily were white, and many, if not most of them, from England. But what had happened was, for thousands of years, kingdoms and hierarchies had dominated Europe. And in 1651, Thomas Hobbes published a book called Leviathan. He was the tutor to King Charles I. And he published this book, Leviathan, arguing two things, principally. One, that people are essentially evil, and therefore there has to be the iron fist of church or state, what he referred to as the Leviathan, something big enough to control all the people. Or the consequence would be that if man reverts to his natural state, life is nasty, brutish, and short. We're all familiar with that quote.
Yes.
The second thing he argued was that even given that humans are fundamentally evil and need to be controlled, that self-government is possible. This was the first major crack in the idea of monarchy in Europe that opened what we refer to as the Enlightenment. 30 some odd years later, in 1670 something, 74, 75, John Locke wrote his second treatise on government. He was the tutor to King James I as a child. And he took it a step farther, and he said, people are actually not fundamentally evil. That's stuff we get out of religious books. And the people who are evil, we acknowledge that's an aberration. And in this, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who was writing at the same time, who was more of an anthropologist, he was noticing, at the time, Europeans were exploring Northern Africa and Western North America and South and Central America. And we're discovering indigenous and Aboriginal people who were living pretty good lives. They were simple lives, but they were happy and they were getting along. And as Ben Franklin famously said when he introduced the 34 Iroquois elders on the opening day of the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787, he said, it would be a strange thing if 5 nations of ignorant savages, which he meant as a compliment, by the way, if 5 nations of ignorant savages have been able to forge a union that has survived in peace for 1,000 years, and 13 colonies of educated Englishmen could not do the same. So, what we had here was this creation of a country out of the Enlightenment itself. Hobbes and Rousseau saying people are fundamentally good and therefore they can govern themselves. Excuse me, Rousseau and Locke. Hobbes saying, no, people are fundamentally evil, but we can govern ourselves. Mm-hmm. John Calvin got into this mix, or at least his followers did, saying, well, we're with Hobbes, people are fundamentally evil, but we also need to pick our own rulers. And so the way we do that is we look for who God has blessed. And those must be the people God wants to run the show. And so that's why Calvinism, not only believes in predestination, but also believes in the notion that rich people are the ones who should run the country because they're the ones that God has already told us he likes the most. So all this stuff, this ferment was going on throughout this period from around 1640 to around 1700. And then, basically 80 or 90 years later, as these ideas were starting to spread around the world and they were really having an impact in the colonies, out of that came these people who were just absolutely enamored with the idea, A, that people are fundamentally good and can govern themselves, that you can have a democracy where 51% of the people, now granted at the time it was men, but the 51% of the people, although again, they didn't even write that into the Constitution. As I said, there were women voting in the years immediately after the ratification of the Constitution. But nonetheless, that we would create a country based on this idea that people can govern themselves. I mean, this is just an extraordinary thing, and it became contagious because, really, as Jefferson wrote about this at some length in his diaries. how they were actually modeling parts of this after the Iroquois Confederacy. It's why Ben Franklin brought those guys to the opening ceremony, and they hung around for 6 days. I don't recall your original question, David, so I'm not sure if I'm answering it. I remember what the direction I wanted to go.
Yeah, I mean, where it's leading is what was the vision?
Yeah. Okay. Well, that was the vision. That you know, let's see if we can actually do what Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau and Montesquieu and some of the other great thinkers of the time said must be possible. You know, when it was blasphemy. I mean, in 1651, when Hobbes published Leviathan, the king literally owned your underwear and your wife in most of England. I mean, you know, it was the tail end of that, obviously, but the Magna Carta back from 400 years before that did not grant rights to average people, only to the aristocracy, which is another thing that's usually missed in history class.
Where you take this is down to the most fundamental question of what is our human nature.
Yes, and that's still the great question.
And part of what's unusual about your history book is you're bringing in the evidence from biology of animals that organize as cooperative communities, essentially as true democracies, where the community goes with the individuals. And I think this is a really, it's a really foundational point to me as well in my own work, that it comes down to what is our assumption about our human possibility and our human nature. And are we individualistic and greedy and materialistic, or are we inherently caring? And I think we've gone through this period in which biology emphasized the competition and the violence in life. But we're also coming now to a perspective within biology and the sciences that cooperation is a part of life and even a part of the larger physical reality of creation. And so what you're doing in this book of beginning to connect these and bring us into a deeper understanding of our human possibilities and the true meaning of democracy, which of course means a whole lot more than having an election every couple of years, is so absolutely foundational to this moment. Because given our environmental crises, the social disintegration and so forth, it is a moment in which we really have to decide who are we. Because if we don't get it together on the cooperative side, we're basically headed for self-extinction by what we're doing to the earth and ultimately to one another.
Amen.
Now,
if I could tell you a quick story about that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Not about the extinction, but about the animals. Back, I don't know how many years ago, it was a few years ago. I first wrote about it in another one of my books. But I was reading one of the science magazines. I'm a member of AAAS, and I get science, every week. And there was this story about these two researchers, Tim Conrad and I forget Roper's last name, and at this university in the UK that were trying to understand how animals made decisions. And they had a herd of red deer on the campus. And there were several watering holes. And so the question was, how do the deer as a herd, because they're herding animals, how do they decide when to go to which water hole? And the assumption was that there would be a big buck, a huge, a big male deer who would be like, leader of the pack and make the decisions. So they put these cameras in the trees and things to keep track of the deer. And because this is actually a big question. I mean, if they stop grazing and go drinking too early, some members of the society of the deer may not get enough to eat. If they go too late, some may get dehydrated. If they go to a watering hole where there's a predator nearby or has been, some are more exposed, some are less. So there's all kinds of variables here. So how do they make this decision in this high risk environment, literally a life and death environment? Because they did have predators there. And what they found was that as the animals were grazing, they would start to point their bodies toward one of the three holes, just different animals, random animals. And that, let's say that there was 100 of them, okay? So 30, 10 are pointing this way, 12 are pointing, whatever. And when they reach the point where there's like 50 of them who are all pointing toward one hole, 50%, then the whole group would get a little more active. And then when one deer added to that 50, when it became a majority, the entire herd would gather together and move to that particular watering hole. And if there was a predator in the region, keep in mind our in Congress, to like remove the president, this vote we're going to have in the Senate in a couple of weeks for really consequential things, we require a 2/3 majority. It actually took 2/3 of them agreeing on a water hole when there was a predator present. So a supermajority. So Conrad and Roper published this, and I called up Tim Conrad in the UK. And I said, I'm a writer and a reporter, and this is a fascinating story. I'm just curious, what happened when you published it? And he said, I said, did you hear from anybody else in any other fields? And he says, it was amazing. He said, the first guy who called me was an etymologist, a bug guy. And he said, we're seeing the same thing with swarming behavior, with our, like a ball of gnats you see in the air in the summer, and that ball of gnats just goes like this and like this. And how do they do that? How do they know? And he said that, we're coming to the conclusion that with every wing beat, they're making a vote. Shall I move a little to the left? Shall I move a little to the right? And then he says, and then I got a call from an ichthyologist, a fish guy. And he's like, this explains schooling behavior. All the fish are voting. And we're starting to do slow motion photography and finding that when they hit 51% have moved 1 degree to the right, the whole school moves 1 degree to the right. To us, it looks like telepathy. It looks like they're psychic. But no, out of their peripheral vision, they're all noticing the votes of all the people around, or all the fish around them. Same thing with birds and flocks. And it turns out that this is like universal from ants to us, right across. It's built into the DNA, which also informs us, and I think this is perhaps the most important point, that it wouldn't be there, right? Understanding evolution, it wouldn't be there if it didn't confer a survival advantage, which tells us that cooperation and democracy are essential to the survival of any species, including our own.
That is such a profound observation. Let me give you another piece of this. I mean, one of the things that I see coming out of science is a recognition that life by its nature can only exist in communities that self-organize to create and maintain the conditions essential to their own existence. And our closest experience with this is our own bodies, which are comprised of tens of trillions of individual decision-making living cells. They're engaged in the constant exchange of energy, nutrients, information, and energy, all to create and maintain this vehicle of our consciousness and instrument of our agency. And we live only so long as this is all going on totally beyond our consciousness. I mean, this is a kind of, a deep fundamental recognition of the nature of life that we're only just beginning to crack the surface of in our modern understanding. And yet it goes so far even beyond what the more traditional societies imagined, even though, just as you say, they were far ahead of us on this democracy. And this goes to the foundation of what we need to learn to do now as we learn to bring ourselves into balance with Earth, which we can do only by doing what life does, which is organizing an exquisite cooperative relationship at the local level where we touch the ground. So what you're doing here is just so profound, and I hope everybody buys your book.
If I could put a punctuation mark on that too.
Yeah.
This is the danger of oligarchy, and why the fourth or fifth chapter, one of the last chapters of the book, is about when oligarchies become tyrannies. Yeah. Because if you look at the emergence of oligarchies around the world over time, both recently and over the last few hundred years, what you find is that oligarchy is actually a very unstable form of governance, because the people know that it's not fair, and fairness is built into us. Ask any 2-year-old, take a room full of 2-year-olds and give all the toys to one of them. You're going to see an explosion. Fairness is built into us. And so people will rebel. And one of two things will happen. Either the oligarchy is diminished in power and democracy returns, or the oligarchs decide to repress those objections and convert their nation into a police state, which is the direction that Donald Trump was taking us not just 2 months ago.
Yeah.
And where we would be, I am convinced right now, if Trump had succeeded in getting another term, that you and I'd probably be in jail right now, because one of the first things they do is they go after the media and the public intellectuals.
Yeah.
And we've seen this in country after country. Orban just did it in Hungary. There's a chapter in my book about how, Donald Trump is just using Viktor Orban's playbook, almost blow by blow. The same language, in fact, make Hungary great again and build a wall. Orban actually built a wall on his southern border to keep out Syrian refugees. So the fact that we have pushed back on that dimension of oligarch, on that one particular oligarch, Donald Trump, we had a billionaire running the country, right? And
yeah.
Talk about an oligarchy, is, I think, a really good sign. But we've got to restore functioning democracy. And if you go back and look at the study that, and I talk about this at some length in the book, that was done by Matthew Gillens and Benjamin Page at Northwestern and Princeton, as I recall, and it was published by Princeton University Press, I believe. I don't have the book in front of me, but or I don't have that reference in front of me, in 2014. What they looked at and what they found was that if you looked at public opinion polls on public policy, what people want made into law, the majority of the people, the bottom 90%, what people want made into law. If you looked at those in that period from 1940 to 1980, kind of the peak of the American middle class and of the modern experiment with democracy, you found that there was a very clear correlation. And that's how we got Medicare and Medicaid and the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and long-term unemployment and federal housing assistance and grants to go to college and subsidies for colleges and new hospitals being built, new schools being built all over the country, all this stuff. It was because the people wanted it. But then when you look after 1981, when Reagan started the process of converting the United States from a democracy to an oligarchy, what you see, what Gillens and Page point out, is that started to collapse quite rapidly, to the point where by the mid to late 1990s, early 2000s, the relationship between what the majority of people want and what actually gets passed in Congress is completely disconnected. There's no relationship between the two. They said statistically it's equivalent to white noise. But there is a very clear correlation, which didn't exist as strongly back in the period from 1940 to 1980. Very clear correlation between what the top 5% want, and in particular what the top 1% want, and what gets made into law. The single legislative accomplishment of the entire Trump 4 years was a $1.5 trillion tax cut that now we're discovering is actually costing us almost $3 trillion. And 84% of the benefit went to the top, to the billionaires and the big corporations, to the very top. And so, anyway, I just wanted to add that point.
Well, another thing I wanted to get into with you, but I think we don't have time because we've only got a few minutes. We want to turn this over to the rest of the group for questions. But your focus on money and how money is a vehicle, is used as a vehicle of control of the many by the few. And I just want to point that out as another very important element of your book, and a reason in itself to buy it, particularly bringing out the importance of debt and currently the role of student debt, medical debt, and consumer debt, and how that basically keeps the entire population in line and desperate making this this oligarchy possible.
Yeah.
Now, but in these last few minutes before we open it up, I think we need to turn it to directly to the political dimension. And the clear situation that the Republican Party is controlled by oligarchs to serve oligarchs. Now, it also sometimes seems that the Democratic Party is also controlled by oligarchs, partly because our politics depends on money, so you have to go where the money is. And I think we're very much in agreement that to have a real democracy, we probably need multiple political parties, all dedicated to democracy, all committed to the well-being of people and Earth, but debating alternative solutions so that we get truly creative in a purposeful way. Now, from your study of oligarchy, what does history tell us about what has to happen to achieve our self-liberation from oligarchy in this particular moment in time?
Oligarchs become oligarchs because they have control of money, which they then use to influence politics. It's a pretty simple equation. So if you want to get control of oligarchy, you get control of the money that's in the political process. That's the simple answer. To put it in a historical context, prior to 1976, we had some pretty good laws in the United States that kept money out of politics. Most of the people who engaged in politics were not wealthy. You'll recall Nixon's famous checkers speech, after he lost that election to Kennedy, was, he talked about how his wife has a cloth coat. They can't afford a fur coat. The dog Checkers was a gift from, a friend or a neighbor. The majority of Congress were middle-class people. There were a few millionaires in the Senate, but it was a very different kind of time and place and world. So what happened in 1976 and 78 was that the Supreme Court ruled for the very first time in the history of the United States that if an individual oligarch, this was in the 76 decision, Buckley versus Vallejo, if an individual oligarch wants to own a politician, to the extent that that politician would not even be elected without that oligarch, and that politician wants to pass legislation and promote legislation that helps that oligarch's specific business, that used to be called bribery and political corruption. But as of the decision, the Buckley decision in 76, that is now officially called speech. That money's not money, it's speech. And it's protected by the First Amendment. 2 years later, in a decision that was authored by Lewis Powell, the author of the Powell memo, in a case called First National Bank versus Bellotti, the Supreme Court ruled that that applies to corporations as well. So this opened a floodgate of cash for the 1980 election. The Republicans said, great, we'll take it. And they coasted that tsunami of cash. Ronald Reagan coasted on that into the White House to a large extent. The Democrats.
What would the founders have thought of that?
Well, let me finish this story and ask you in just a minute, okay? The Democrats, though, looked at those decisions and said, doesn't matter to us, because at that point in time, a third of America had a union job. And so American working class people were paying money into unions, and the unions were using some of that money to support Democratic politicians. And so basically, the working class was supporting the Democratic Party, and the Republicans went out and said, okay, we'll take the money from everybody. So when Reagan came into power, his first job was to defund the Democratic Party, to destroy their base of funding, to destroy them because keep in mind, Republicans have been out of power at that point in time since 1930. Or since 1932. I mean, they'd only held the House for 2 years. In fact, they didn't hold the House again until 1996 when Newt Gingrich did it. And they sporadically held the Senate, and most people thought Eisenhower was a Democrat, as far as presidents go. So Reagan went after the unions. He destroyed PATCO in 1 week, one of the only two unions that actually endorsed him for president. And did such a thorough job. You put an anti-labor guy, Ray Donovan, in charge of the Labor Department, which was unheard of, the first time that had ever happened. And in the 12 years of the Reagan-Bush administration, They so gutted the unions that by 1992, Bill Clinton could not get enough money from unions to run for president. So him and Al Fromm got together and created this thing called the DLC, the Democratic Leadership Council, specifically to funnel money from corporations. But they were going to do it ethically. We're not going to take money from big oil and steel and polluting industries. We'll take money from the clean industries, the good industries, insurance, banks, tech. And, he made a deal with the devil. And that's why he ended up basically selling us out, with his trade deals and ending welfare as we know it. And the end of, it's the end of the era of big government and reversing much of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. And it set up it terribly weakened the Democratic Party and provided a space for Republicans to step into that space for many, many years. But now that the Obama campaign, the Clinton campaign, the Bernie Sanders campaign, and now the Joe Biden campaign have demonstrated that it's possible at the federal level and even at the state level with Ossoff and Warnock in Georgia have all demonstrated that we can now Democrats can once again have their campaigns funded by average working people. It's just now by direct contributions rather than by other unions. Many members of the Democratic Party are openly discarding their former embrace of Clintonism / neoliberalism / oligarchy. And you've got, about 100 members now of the Progressive Caucus, and all of them have committed not to take corporate PAC money. I see that as a really, really healthy sign in our body politic. The Republican Party is still hopelessly corrupt and completely committed to rich people and big corporations, as is about a third of the Democratic Party. But this half of the Democratic Party that's emerging gives me great hope. And you balance that against, this attempted fascist overthrow, fascism being the merger of corporate and state interests that Trump led. And it's amazing, it's like the brightest light creates the darkest shadow, or the darkest shadow makes the brightest light more visible. We live in such an extraordinary moment, and we really have to be aware of how we got here and how this could play out if it goes wrong or if it goes right.
And you're playing such a role in this. You really ought to get yourself a radio talk show where you can.
Yeah, thank you, David.
Just to remind, if anybody wasn't aware, he is the leading progressive talk show host in, I'd say, in the world, probably.
I don't know.
Anyhow, I think it's time to turn it over to questions. So Emily, back to you, and see where you can take us.
I've got a lot of questions here for you. I think just a quick one to start it off. A lot of people are asking about that study about cooperation in animals, and we are having trouble finding it to post in the chat. Can you just give us the title and author one more time so we can find it for folks?
The two authors were Conrad, C-O-N-R-A-D-T, and Roper. And their two names should bring it up. And because it's been written about numerous times, and there have been a number of other studies since then that basically say the same thing. There was something in Nature magazine just last year about democracy in the animal kingdom.
Perfect, thank you.
There's also a book, and Emily, you probably know this because you work at the bookstore. I read this last year when it first came out, or maybe the year before last, by a Dutch writer, and I'm sorry, it's been a long day. I don't remember his name and I don't remember the title of the book, but it's basically about democracy and political. Do you know what I'm talking about? It was a New York Times major bestseller.
As far as Dutch books go, Humankind, A Hopeful History.
Yes, that's it. Humankind. Yeah. That book is filled with this stuff.
Yes. I read that one and I actually thought of that when you mentioned it. It's an excellent one. We'll drop that in the chat for folks too. But to get to some of the audience questions here, I think the top question we have is from Terry. And Terry asks, how do constitutional originalists get so off track from the meaning of the founders?
Originalism is the kind of scam that Jim Baker, Jimmy Swaggart, and Billy Graham Jr. would be proud of. It emerged in a big way in the 1970s, following the Powell memo. there had been people throughout history, throughout American history, who had called themselves originalists, but it was never a coherent philosophy, and it never had a large following until the late 70s, early 80s. And basically what originalists claim is that they are able to know what was in the minds of the founders. Just like, the televangelists will tell you they know what was in Jesus's mind or in God's mind. And they alone know this, right? The average person, you don't know. And so when they want to achieve a certain outcome, they go looking for stuff that will give them that outcome. I read about this at some length in both my hidden history book on the Supreme Court and also the one on guns. The ones on guns is fascinating. The Heller decision that found in the minds of the founders, Scalia found that the founders actually intended in the Second Amendment, which was actually written to protect the slave patrols of Virginia and North Carolina or South Carolina. But he found in their minds that they actually intended everybody to be able to have a gun for self-defense. And he had to have some arcane sounding justification for that. So he sent his little crew of whatever they call them, worker bees in the Supreme Court off in search, and they couldn't find anything. I mean, you can't, I did this search when I was writing the book on guns and the Second Amendment, the origin of the Second Amendment. So, where did this originate? Where did this come from, this idea of guns? And it just you can't find this among the writings of the founders. Nowhere will you find any of them saying, well, it's so you can overcome an oppressive government if you need to, or, oh, it's so you can protect yourself and, in the event bad guys come to your house. Nothing, except for one tract that was published in a rural part of Pennsylvania by an anti-federalist, a guy who was, and this was before the Constitution was ratified. It was in 1788, the year before the ratification, the year after the Constitution was written, when the Constitution was being debated, when the Federalist Papers were being published by Madison and Jay and Hamilton. And this one anti-federalist, anti-Constitution guy posited that there should be a provision in the Constitution that provides that everybody can have weaponry to protect themselves because there's crazy Indians out there. And he takes this one tract that nobody ever heard of, nobody ever read. It was, this obscure thing that was limited to one little county in Pennsylvania, and says, see, proof from the founding generation. Originalism is a scam, period, full stop.
That's a great answer. I didn't know a lot of that, so thank you. The next question comes from Ken, and Ken asks, given that democracy is so critical to practical success, could you speak to the risks we take if we allow distortion or suppression of voting behavior? I'm concerned with mechanisms such as the Electoral College and gerrymandering.
Yeah, the Electoral College is anti-democratic. It's not democratic. And without going into great detail, I mean, the original idea came from the Whig histories, the idea of the Vicar-Gemeinschaft that existed in England prior to the Norman invasion, which was basically a council of wise elders. The question that they were confronting at that time was, how can somebody who lives in Georgia get to know somebody who's running for president in DC? How can even the whole state of Georgia get to know them? It took a week, sometimes 3 weeks, for a newspaper to get from one place to the other. So the idea was, we'll select wise elders and they'll go to DC and they'll meet these people and they will, and Hamilton actually writes about this in one of the Federalist Papers, I think it's 54. And they'll get to know these people and they'll be able to weed out what Hamilton referred to as drunkards and men of low character. But, so you could say that maybe it was an appropriate thing at the time, but within 15, 20 years, certainly within 50 years with the advent of the railroads, or 70 years, it was a complete anachronism and it needs to be done away with, and it's fundamentally anti-democratic. But the Republican Party continues to hang on to it because it's the only way they hold power. The Republicans in the Senate, for example, represent 41 million fewer people than the Democrats do, but it's 50-50, another example of disproportionate representation. And of course, voter suppression, the New York Times had a piece just 2 days ago about, Democrats won big in the last election, Republicans are working to make it harder to vote. Over 200 pieces of legislation have been introduced in the last 2 weeks in state legislatures all across the country, principally red states and purple states, to make it more difficult to vote. That if you want to vote by mail, you have to have your ballot, you have to go to the bank and have it notarized. You have to make photocopies of your ID and mail it in. You have to have a letter from your doctor. I mean, these are all actual real pieces of legislation that are being proposed right now by Republicans in various states. I live in Oregon. We have, for 20 years now, we have had mail-in voting. It's so cool. You get your ballot 6 weeks before the election. You get a real thick little kind of TV guide-like booklet about every single candidate and every single ballot issue. Louise and I sit at the table and Google everybody, and anybody we don't know anyway, and you mail and you stick it in the mail and postage paid, and that's it. And the fraud rate here in Oregon, voter fraud, of course, is a scam. The fraud rate in the 20 years we've been doing it is a total of maybe 10 or 12 people have been busted for doing, for messing with the vote, for voting somebody else's ballot or something. It's something that should go national. We need a national mail-in vote. The idea of having a voting day, I think, is another anachronism. So I'm with your person who is concerned about that. And a lot of these reforms, including expanding mail-in voting, are in the first piece of legislation that Nancy Pelosi intends to get out of the House of Representatives, H.R. 1, and its parallel version, SB 1. The problem is, because they are not attached to a budget item, they can't be passed by reconciliation, which would allow them to ignore a filibuster. And so they're going to be subject to the filibuster, which requires 60 votes. We've only got 51 votes out of 100, or out of 101, and including the vice president. So it's a really important time for everybody to write down a phone number that I'm going to give you in just a second, and it's the phone number for the switchboard at the Capitol building, and ask for Senator Manchin, ask for Senator Sinema, Kristen Sinema of Arizona. And also ask for any other senator that you think appropriate, including your two senators, and tell them that you want the filibuster ended. Because if we don't end the filibuster, Democrats and Joe Biden will not be able to go big and actually reform our democracy like this. It makes it much more. This HR 1 makes it much more difficult. For example, in Georgia, the Secretary of State threw a couple 100,000 people off the voting rolls in the 2 years before the last election. This is a pattern we see over and over and over again in Republican-controlled states, purging the voting rolls. This bill would make that much harder. I'm getting daily hysterical emails from FreedomWorks about, they're calling it the Gag Act, because it forces billionaire donors to reveal their identities. And of course, FreedomWorks has started with the Koch network. So the phone number is 202-224-3121. You'll get an operator. You just say, I'd like to speak to Senator so-and-so's office, and they'll put you right through.
Thank you for that. I can see it's important we all make those calls.
Yeah, if you want democracy to endure.
Yes. To stay on the topic of democracy, the next question is from Hanuman, who asks, why is the American democracy a two-party system and all the other democracies are parliamentary with multi-parties? Can we evolve out of the Electoral College and just be a democratic republic where the majority elects their candidates?
That's a great question. And by the way, David, please jump in at any point, interrupt me or punctuate.
You're doing so well. I'm just fascinated.
Thank you.
Pleasure to be here.
Well, the simple answer to the question is because John Stuart Mill wasn't born until after most of the founders were dead. In 1861, John Stuart Mill published a book called On Liberty. And in that book, he proposed what we now refer to as proportional representation. That a parliament should, if a national political party gets 12% of the vote, they should have 12% of the seats in parliament. If they get 30% of the vote, they should have 30% of the seats, et cetera. It literally was not a thing prior to that. And that's why the older democracies that pre-exist John Stuart Mill are like ours. Australia, New Zealand, the UK, Canada, they all basically started out as two-party systems. Now, Australia and New Zealand got around that with instant runoff voting, which allows for multiple parties. It's a little, and in the UK and in Canada, they've tweaked it over the years, as it were. But most of, virtually all the other, keep in mind, we were the first to really do this incredible experiment based on Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau and Montesquieu. And when it worked at first, people were like, oh, that's cool, but I'm not believe in this. And then when the Civil War happened, there were a lot of countries that were like, you know, oh, see, I told you so, it ain't going to happen. But after the Civil War and after, you know, we were able to demonstrate that the country could hold together, that's when we started seeing this proliferation of democracies around the world, where we went from literally 5 or 6 democracies in the 1870s to nearly 100 democracies a decade ago. Now the number of democracies is actually shrinking, sadly, but and almost all of them are adopting proportional representation. To do it here would be, at the national level, would require a constitutional amendment. You'd have to change the nature of the Senate and the House, and that ain't going to happen. You know, the Republicans will not allow that. The bar for a constitutional amendment is too high. But there is the nationalpopularvote.com program that almost got Virginia. The Republicans just killed it. It would have taken it to 209 electoral votes. When they hit 270 representing states with 270 electoral votes, that's the end of the Electoral College. So check out nationalpopularvote.com if you want to educate yourself about that. And then the other thing that we could do to make the Senate at least a little more proportional, like I said, Democrats in the Senate, who hold an identical number of seats to Republicans, represent 41 million more Americans than do Republicans, would be to add a couple states. And I would suggest DC and Puerto Rico as a starting point, but I think that we could even go beyond that and perhaps incorporate, you know, the Virgin Islands and Guam and some of the other territories into a third state. And this is not, by the way, a novel idea to do this for political purposes. Abraham Lincoln needed 2 more Republican votes in the Senate. At that time, it took 124,000 people living in a territory to make that territory eligible to become a state. There were 14,700 people living in Nevada at the time. He made Nevada a state just to get 2 senators. And then in the 1890s, and I forget which president it was, but another Republican president, again, needed a couple more Republicans. The Dakota territories, which was one lump in the entire territory, there was fewer than 100,000 people. And that president divided the Dakota territory into 2 to get 4 senators and got that passed. So, you know, adding states for political purposes has a long and noble tradition.
Are any of your books used in history classes, Tom?
I don't know. I let myself get polemic probably too frequently in these books, you know, where I'll rant about Republicans, like the Supreme Court book, and I go on about how Republicans stole the White House just to be able to pack the Supreme Court. So Emily, probably not.
Emily and I are, I know I'm so much older than her, but I think we're both reflecting on our own experience in history class. Why didn't I ever hear any of this in history class?
Yeah. What's the book by Kenneth Davis? Lies My Teacher Told Me.
Yeah. Exactly.
I think we've got time for 1 or 2 more here. So I just want to run through a couple of these. An anonymous attendee asks, with social media algorithms directly affecting human behavior, how do we bring cooperation back into politics?
That is the biggest question we're facing right now. The book that I'm actually writing right now, which will be out in the spring of 2022, is titled The Hidden History of Big Brother. And it's about privacy. And you know, both about half the book will be corporate invasions of our privacy and destruction of our privacy, and the other half will be government invasion and destruction of our privacy. And I'm right now in the phase of doing research on it, and I've just been up to my eyeballs for 5, 6, 7 hours a day, you know, reading and researching. I just went all the way back to 1275. Edward III, you know, ratified the first actual privacy legislation in the United Kingdom that became the basis of what Lord Coke said in 1645, that a man's home is his castle. But this idea that we can be manipulated by algorithm to increase Mark Zuckerberg's billions, and obviously it's not just Mark Zuckerberg, is something that we're going to have to come to terms with. The European Union is at least 5 years ahead of us in this debate and in trying to do something about it. And we need to be paying attention and learning from what they're doing. I don't have an easy answer for that. I hope to by the time I finish writing this next book.
And for a final question, I want to ask this one from Virginia about another pressing issue in politics in this country right now, which is, how can we get money out of politics when our money system, made law in 1913, gives the private bankers the privilege and power to create our money supply as debt? The system transfers wealth from the many to the few. So without changing the money system back to government-created asset money, the kind of money that won our Revolutionary and Civil Wars, how can we get money out of public decision-making?
Well, the Revolutionary War was not won on the gold standard. You know, and neither was the Civil War for that matter. There was a lot of script floating around, and a lot of it has no value right now. The problem with the gold standard, which is what this person is referring to, is that if you say that the number of dollars in circulation is a function of the amount of gold that a country has, and the economy expands by, say, 2% in the course of a year, if you don't acquire 2% more gold, the value of your currency is going to, or the price of your currency, not the value, but the price of your currency is going to go up 2%. If your economy goes down, the price of your, and you don't sell off gold, the price of your currency is going to go down. I mean, in a relatively stable or small economy, you know, it worked. It was principally because of the problem of counterfeiting. You know, that there would be something that was, nobody debated whether it had value or not, which was gold. But, you know, we're way beyond that. And going back to a gold standard right now would stultify, would rigidify our economy. And frankly, I think would cement the oligarchy even more firmly. The first part of that question, though, before it wandered off into Federal Reserve paranoia.
I am seeing a quick correction from her, sorry, in the chat. She just, I think, wanted to let you know she's not talking about gold money, talking about greenbacks.
Right. Oh, you mean the ones that Lincoln issued?
Yeah, greenbacks, money created by the people.
Right. Yeah. Well, you know, there's that's a discussion, you know, how we reinvent our money that is certainly beyond the scope of any of the books that I've written, and I don't feel you know, qualified to really give a good answer on. I'm sorry.
Yeah, and that gets into all sorts of issues around how private banks now create the money.
Right.
And money creation should be a transparent public process and used to serve public purposes, to meet public needs.
That's right. You're the guy with a PhD in economics.
Not in economics, in business. Yeah.
Oh, close enough.
Harvard Business School. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. I mean, I mean, everything that Thom has said about money, I would agree with. But the key thing is that we have been in a process of transferring money creation over to a combination of private banks and the financial markets. And so the banks loan it into existence, which then you got more money out there that has to be repaid with interest. And this is why we get into the GDP trap, that the reason GDP has to keep growing in order to not collapse, for the economy to not collapse, is because it's got to grow. So there's always more money being created to pay the interest on the money that was loaned out previously. Now then, we've got all of these crazy things in the financial markets where people create various kinds of derivatives that have absolutely no intrinsic value, but somehow you can sell them in the market. And then we've got these cryptocurrencies that people create. I mean, if you want to get rich, the best thing to do is just create your own money and issue it. And if everybody will buy it with the official currency, man, you are in cool. But we're now in a situation where most of our money is being created through these crazy processes that have nothing to do with the public. And you know, essentially, money has to be a public process. It has to be totally transparent, and it has to be used to serve public purposes.
And David, would it be correct to say that the banks loan money into existence, skim a little piece off the top for doing that, and then as that money is unwound, as it's paid back, The interest is still due in most cases. And so it's very much like a game of musical chairs, where every time you play a full round of it, one more person drops out, that being, or one more pile of interest gets accumulated.
Well, on the side of the borrowers.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the things you talk about in your book. That's absolutely right on. But on the banker's side, they're just accumulating more assets.
Right.
It's always fascinating to me that when we talk about, you know, how much debt is being created, we never talk about who the debt is owed to. And that's something about debt. There's always a creditor for every debtor.
Right. So the bankers are the guys playing the piano for the game of musical chairs, and
right. You're all out there, and we're all focused on the musical chairs, and the real game is over here.
Right. Exactly. And the people playing musical chairs are the consumers, and every round one of them dies, gets knocked out. Okay, Emily.
And so that scares the shit out of the rest of us.
Yeah, there you go.
That's one of the it's one of the ways to keep control. That's with that fear.
Well, that's why there's a chapter about debt peonage in the hidden history of oligarchy. I mean,
you say it so well there, so well.
Well, that was great. I loved that last question there, because I think you guys got into such a great discussion. I know we've got a ton more questions from the audience, but I also know we're over time here. So I'm seeing thanks to both of you in the chats, and I want to add my own. I hope that for your next book, you come back and see us again, and maybe in person next time when we can all safely gather. And I just want to thank everyone out there for joining us. Please do purchase a copy of the book. And I hope you all take care and have a wonderful night.
Thank you so much, Emily. And thanks to Powell.
Thank you.
And thank you, David.
Great job. Tom. It's great.